So when you hear somebody say, you know, it would really be nice if we could be like the early church. Well, actually, they were a lot more divided than we are. You can be absolutely sure that those words are not found or not written during the first few centuries of the church. And it reminds us that even in a community that is supposed to point to Chilton tells the story of a Pentecostal holiness church in East Tennessee, right at the edge of tobacco farming area. It seems that most of the males in this particular church, most of the men own tobacco farms. And the preacher at this Pentecostal holiness church decided, as he was reading Paul one day, that we should give up sinful ways and tobacco was sinful. So he preached a sermon about it about 3 months after the tobacco harvest. The next Sunday, all the women in the church were very upset and wanting to show support for their pastor. They called a congregational meeting and they excommunicated from the church all the men in the church that owned tobacco farms. They denounced them as sinners. They were still welcome to come to worship, but they weren't members. They couldn't vote. Until about a month before tobacco harvest, when the preacher decided, it might be a good idea to preach about forgiveness, and then they were all voted back into church in time to give the money that came in from the harvest to the church. Somehow I'm not sure that's what Jesus meant when he talked about binding and loosing. But what I am sure that he's about when he talks about whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven, it does say that what we do, the lives we live, the love that we share, the work that we do, whether it's in the church or in the workplace, it all has something to do with what God intends to do in the world. When was the last time you thought of yourself as a co-worker with God? A co-lover with God? And yet, Scripture tells us over and over and over again that that is the truth about ourselves. If only we would believe it. We are reminded each week when we gather to worship of our freedom to worship and of the freedom of God's grace that meets us without any qualification. But something happens, when we hear that assurance of forgiveness. We're sure that we're forgiven, but we're not quite sure